Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening and welcome to the University of Virginia Center for Politics 23rd Annual American Democracy Conference. I'm Dr. Kara Ong Whaley, Associate Director of the James Madison Center for Civic Engagement at James Madison University and your host for the evening. If you have questions for the panelists this evening, please send them to questions@virginia.edu and we'll be able to address them later in the program. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to our next event on Thursday, November 11th at 7 p.m. for the premiere of Common Grounds. This film is a project of 5 Center for Politics interns and is the culmination of 9 months of work. The interns will bring together the student leaders from a wide spectrum of political ideologies. The goal was never to have students compromise on their political beliefs, but to see if they'd be willing to talk about those beliefs in an effort to understand each other. Dr. Larry Sabato will introduce the film, and after the viewing, there'll be a panel discussion with the makers of the film that's moderated by Professor Cherie Moore. This event is available in person and virtually. To register, please go to eventbrite.com and search for Common Grounds Premiere. And now to get started for this evening, we're going to begin with Drs. Larry Shack and Dr. Mick Williams. Drs. Robert Mick McWilliams and Larry Shack are the co-founders of Project Homefire, a new initiative dedicated to finding common ground in American politics that is working with the UVA Center for Politics to explore and address the political, social, and psychological divides of the American electorate. Larry and Mick, thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if you can share results from your recent polling and analytics to frame our conversation about the state of American democracy and how we should think about addressing the deep political fissures in our country.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara, and nice to see everybody. Project Homefire began and was focused on building public civility and inspiring public trust. We fielded a survey to uncover the opportunities to do just that. That survey fielded in July and August of this year. We talked to 1,001 Trump voters, 1,012 Biden voters, across more than 300 variables. These span policy, psychographics, demographics, underlying attitudes and opinions, everything we could possibly come up with to, in a sense, map the mind of the market as we looked at the electorate and looked to find and uncover these corridors as it relates to building civility and inspiring public trust. This slide highlights the 4 main findings of the work. First, and we've been publishing these findings in consultation and cooperation with the center. First, this idea that voters are at crisis stage. We coined the phrase and have been working on highlighting how the divide that exists is both deep and wide and also dangerous. We have found that there is policy agreement at the federal level. Some of the bills and the infrastructure policies being debated in Congress, Trump voters and Biden voters actually have agreement there. But that agreement is very much tempered by the deep levels of fear and deep levels of distrust that exist between Biden voters and Trump voters, and we'll show some data on that point. The second big finding, and this is something that has probably been shown in other research, this idea that the deck is stacked against them. More specifically, when we talked to Trump and Biden voters, and this was the same across both of those 2 cohorts, they see a system that is run by and rigged for the benefit of the wealthy, not for them. And when you step back and think about that in the context of, all right, there's this fear and distrust, government isn't working for me, where does that lead us? This idea that their commitment to democracy is wavering. What is that? That's the dangerous part of the divide. And what does that look like? Both Trump and Biden voters are countenancing sort of anti-democratic actions. These range from society taking things into their own hands to support for the idea that the president should be able to act unilaterally, free from constraint when it comes to Congress and the courts to push an agenda forward. And I think finally, one of the things that really popped for us in this research, something that other research has touched upon that I think we went a little bit deeper on, is this idea of race and immigration and the outsized roles that those issues play in animating this divide. Biden voters emphasize social justice concerns, and we'll see it in some of the data that we're going to talk about. But Trump voters focus very much on immigration and very much on what immigration means for them personally, socially, culturally, economically. It animates a worldview in ways that we haven't seen in research at this point. It is in many ways fuel for the deep, wide, and dangerous divide as we've looked at it. We'll go to the next slide, please. So some data that goes across these 4 points. First, voters are at crisis stage. What does that look like? Well, on the left, what we see is this idea of 8 in 10 Trump voters, 8 in 10 Biden voters, basically saying the other side presents as a clear and present danger. The other side being both the elected officials from the other side, as well as those who support them. On the right, we see this idea that some media sources on both the left and the right have become so untruthful that they should be censored. And then in the middle, and I think most worryingly, 9 in 10 voters, 88% of Biden voters, 89% of Trump voters worry that people like me will not belong in America anymore if the other side has its way. Thinking again about these viewpoints, these are not policy-based necessarily, these are not entirely rationally based. There are feelings, there are emotions, they are real and they are visceral, and they contribute to the deep divide as we discussed it. Next slide. Secondly, this idea that the second 2 points, that the deck is stacked against them and their commitment to democracy is wavering. On the far left, the question that we asked is represented in the data. 2/3 of Trump voters, 2/3 of Biden voters expressing agreement that the system is rigged against them and at the service of the wealthy. And where does that lead them? Look left to right, the idea that society should take things into their own hands. As I said earlier, that the president should be able to take needed action without being constrained by Congress or the courts. And then finally, all the way to the right, something that we talked about, this idea of secession, with Biden voters saying it would be better if blue states seceded from the union, and Trump voters saying it would be better for everyone if red states seceded from the union. To the next slide, please. So race and immigration, coming back to that point. Looking on the left, Biden voters, a strong focus, the blue bars, on discrimination against minorities. And then you come to that last piece on the right of that chart, Trump voters, a strong focus on increasing discrimination against whites. What animates that? Look over to the piece on immigration. On the right chart, we have a chart that very clearly highlights, look at the red bars from top to bottom, immigration and the effects and the fears that it has for Trump voters on how they will suffer higher taxes, lower job prospects, higher housing costs, domestic violence, domestic terrorism. This animates a worldview. These worldviews, in a sense, could not be more opposed between Biden and Trump voters. And one of the things that we saw in this research was how immigration really does sit at the center of, typically when you think about political polls, you'll say, well, what are the issues that are important to people? They might say the economy, taxes, jobs, etc. What we see in this chart is that immigration is animating opinions across all of those policy areas, previously discrete policy areas that now have a home in the home nest with this idea of immigration and what it means for Trump voters. To the next slide. And these divisions, as not surprisingly, yield major policy tensions. If we look at the blue bars at the top, Biden voters prioritizing minority rights, protecting minority rights across a range of different populations. Go down to the bottom, you see the red bars, Trump voters prioritizing reducing illegal immigration, preventing voter fraud. Voting rights, we had a piece that was released today. Voting rights is a huge issue, obviously being considered at the national level, obviously being debated across 49 or 50 states at this point. And you can just see, again, a picture can sometimes be worth 1,000 words, how these two cohorts differ from each other. And you can imagine, again, the tensions that creates from a policy standpoint. Now, go to the next slide, please. We've talked about the bad, but as we said, Project Home Fire's goal is to uncover the ideas of how do we build civility, how do we inspire trust, and there is hope. There truly is hope, and I think that we've uncovered some really interesting data about that. We have uncovered people. We ran a complete clustering analysis on this idea of openness to compromise. Number one, people who say Americans should work together to find common ground, and our congressional representatives should work to find common ground. And as part of this clustering analysis, we also looked at Biden and Trump voters through the lens of how less dissimilar are they from each other. Looking at Biden voters who express opinions that are less dissimilar from Trump voters than other Biden voters, and vice versa. So looking for those people who, in a sense, are willing to get into a room and talk about the issues that are affecting our lives and are willing to get in that room with people who voted from the other side. These are our committed compromisers, and we'll get into some of the other groups that pop from them, but they are 40 million strong. They value compromise and consensus over conflict. They are in significant ways less dissimilar from each other than even they realize. And that middle piece, 2/3 of them are Biden voters, 1/3 are Trump voters. They are more likely to be women than they are likely to be men. And given Mick and I's backgrounds, one of the things that we really focused on is, all right, how do we engage these people? Where do they want to engage, and how do they need to be appealed to? And what we've uncovered in the research are what we are calling compromise corridors, which what others might call messaging corridors, messaging pathways, ways to start a conversation with these committed compromisers to build civility, to inspire trust, to get us pulling in unison and together versus apart. The first thing that emotes, they're not all created equal, but what we did find is these are programs and values voters. They're receptive to the theme of making government work for people, and they worry about and are therefore likelier to want to take steps to proactively address issues from race and immigration, balancing responsibility with opportunity, to voting rights, balancing free with fair, and to clean energy and climate change, balancing our needs today with the safety of the planet. So these present as corridors in a sense for engaging this committed compromise cohort to start a conversation, to start a dialogue, and to help them and others realize that we can accomplish and get to better solutions together than any side can get to on its own. Now, obviously, the panel is going to focus tonight on sort of looking forward, 2022, and what does this mean, and how might our work, in a sense, help to inform that? So if we go to the next slide, as I said, sticking with the analysis that we did there, it was a complete clustering analysis. We identified, as I said, these folks on the left, if you will, this base group of committed compromisers, those who are compromise receptive Trump and Biden voters who care about policy issues and express opinions, again, that are less dissimilar from those of the other. We also identified, if you go all the way over to the right, a reach group of 26% folks loaded in the base, 36% of folks loaded in the reach group. We talked about this, our internal, their conflict hardcores, if you will, people who are less likely to want to get in a room and talk about the issues that are impacting their lives and other people's lives, and certainly less likely to want to get in that room with people who voted for the other side. And between these two groups, between the base and the swing, or between the base and the reach, there is a 38% group that loads in the swing, less compromise receptive, if you will, than the base, more compromise receptive, again, than the reach. So what we did is we took the work that we've done around this idea of compromise receptivity, compromise clusters, compromise corridors, and said, why don't we look at it through the lens of 2022 voting intent? Why don't we think about how do people who load closer on the compromise scale versus closer on the conflict scale say they're going to vote in 2022? Here's what we found. The base and the swing groups, totaling 64% of the electorate, are more likely to include people who say they will vote Democrat than Republican in 2022. The reach group, totaling 36% of the electorate, is more solidly Republican. Those who say they'll vote for the most qualified candidate basically is relatively even across the base, the swing, and the reach groups. So when we step back and think about that, Democrats loading more heavily, those who say they will vote for Democrats loading more heavily in the base and swing, those who will say they are less likely to compromise loading more highly in the reach. And we think about Tuesday, what happened Tuesday, but most importantly, what is happening, what we're looking towards in 2022. The thrust of the analysis, and as I've been reading the coverage, is what did Republicans do right? What did Democrats do wrong? And a lot of it is about what should Democrats do next? What does our analysis suggest? Our analysis, the thrust of it is that if Democrats want to maintain their very slim congressional majorities in 2022, it is in their interest to make the case on compromise over conflict. It's in their interest to put the theme of government working for people, as we saw on the previous slide, at the center of that pitch. It's in their interest to craft an appeal that balances values and cultural concerns with policy positions. And it is in their interest to make use of messaging that targets both the head and the heart, both how voters think, and as we saw in the dangerous divide, most importantly, how voters feel. what animates their concerns, what animates their divisions, and how people can speak to that and speak to that in a way that is accretive to community and commonality. So in sum, and looking forward to the panel, taking this forward and thinking about 2022, what have we done? As Project Home Fire, it's been a pleasure and a delight to work with the staff at the center. And I think through this research, we've gotten to a point where we have identified tens of millions of voters who are anxious about what's going on in society today, who see ongoing conflict as a bad thing, who push back on the idea that our path forward is fixed, who prioritize working together proactively to address the concerns that they have, and who are looking for leaders who elevate compromise and community over anger and alienation. As Project Home Fire, we look forward to continuing to drill into this group to understand them better and to come up with ways to engage them and activate them in ways that are helpful and supportive of our democracy. And we look forward again to tonight and the panel to come and their discussion of 2022 and beyond. So with that, Kara, I'll turn it back to you and over to the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry and Mick, for your really important work and path-breaking work. I'm looking forward to drilling down a bit into your findings, and to think and have our panelists consider how we can move forward and find solutions to the precarious state we find ourselves in American democracy today. Let me introduce briefly our panelists for this evening, and then I have some questions to get us going. First, Tara Setmeyer. Setmeyer is a sought-after political commentator and former communications director on Capitol Hill. She's made numerous appearances on, she regularly contributes to ABC's The View, Good Morning America, CNN primetime programs, and Nightline. She is the host of the Center for Politics' recent three-part documentary, Dismantling Democracy. Barbara Comstock is also joining us tonight. She's a senior advisor with Baker Donelson, offering clients decades of policy experience in the legislative, administrative, and private sector arenas, as well as a lifetime of relationships to build winning coalitions and strategies. Barbara was elected to Congress in 2014 and served 2 terms representing Virginia's 10th congressional district, making her the first woman elected to that seat. We also have Jamelle Bouie, who is an opinion columnist for the New York Times and a political analyst for CBS News. He previously was a chief political correspondent for Slate magazine. He's also contributed to the center's book, Barack Obama and the New America, the 2012 election and the changing face of politics. He's also a UVA graduate, wahoo wah. Kyle Klondike is also joining us. Kyle is the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the University of Virginia Center for Politics' authoritative, nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections. He's frequently cited as an expert on American politics and has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and most importantly, Comedy Central's The Daily Show. David Ramadan is also joining us this evening. He served in Virginia House of Delegates from 2012 to 2016. He's an executive and international consultant with over 25 years of experience in business, government relations, leadership, management, marketing, communications, public policy, public relations, immigration, community affairs, legislative advocacy, grassroots, and minority engagement. David is an adjunct professor at George Mason University, which is also his alma mater, and has served on George Mason University's Board of Visitors. And then we have with us, finally, we have with us Damon Irby, who has served as the University of Virginia Center for Politics Director of Global Initiatives since the spring of 2009. And he has written grant proposals on behalf of the center to host international exchanges, most of which are funded by the U.S. Department of State. Thank you all so much for joining us. So we heard from Larry and Mick and from the Center for Politics Project Home Fire polling and analysis that roughly 8 out of 10 Trump and Biden voters both view democracy as preferable to any non-democratic kind of government. I think that's probably the best news coming out of this. But we also heard that there's a lot of widespread distrust and disillusionment that each side of voters has with the other side. And also, as Larry mentioned, the perceptions of a system that is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful. I wonder what we can do to address this widespread distrust and disillusionment as we move forward, as it has undermined faith in our representative democracy. Barbara, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, great to be with you. And Kyle, congratulations on the accurate call on the crystal ball. And
Bit of our teeth, but we got it. We got it in the end.
and no, I think we've in a long time in our history we've not had sort of somebody who was president, the former president, demagogue issues the way Donald Trump did on his loss and the whole January 6th event. But I do think as he moves to the rearview mirror, that sort of authoritarian response that people that he voiced and then got his followers to maybe think maybe that's what we need to do. I am certainly optimistic, and that's what I'm working. That's what I work on. As in my hobby life of politics now is to dissipate, what he created. And I think in a way, he also created that response on the left in some part, although it was also there because they said, well, if he's going to do that, we have to do that and have this undemocratic response. And we have to just push things through no matter, even if we don't have coalitions and support. So, and I think that's why you have, this big swings that you have back and forth, because both sides are ignoring that America lives in the middle and that we are a centrist country. And so if you are center right just by a few votes or even by, say, 20 votes in the House, or you are center left, which right now certainly the Democrats are just minor majority, you have to build coalitions and work together. And one of the things that I think is good about Glenn Youngkin's win, and already what you saw today when he met with Governor Northam, as well as the very civil Terry McAuliffe put out a statement, I guess yesterday, that was gracious, and he conceded. And I think if it had been reversed, you would have seen Glenn Youngkin do the same thing. And people are seeing this return to normal somewhat, at least at the top with these people, and saying, oh, we can have people who support our ideas and support our principles, but are also nice people and will not be sore losers like the sore loser twice impeached guy, but will accept and then try and work together. And I do think you're going to see, because it's obviously Glenn Youngkin will have a Democrat Senate and a narrow House majority. I think you are going to see from the beginning, and I expect to probably see it with the tone of who he appoints, you're going to see kind of like what you saw with Bob McDonnell, where he, even though we had a pretty big majority, he really tried to, bring people together and work together. Governor's bills were often shared with Democrats and that type of thing. So I hope there will be a turn away from that, because the voice of Trump amplifying that, and I think what you've seen now is with him not on Twitter, with him not on the ballot, and with him not, as our candidate, you did see less of an impact. Obviously, people able to outrun the Trump numbers significantly, I think from 10 to 12, which was something that was not possible, while he was in office. He was an anchor around everyone's neck. And so that undemocratic anchor that many of us here, work to get rid of, I am optimistic that, I realize it's still, an uphill battle. But I'm optimistic if he is nominated again, he will lose unless the Democrats just totally decide, to go crazy too.
Jamel, I want to bring you into the conversation. Is it enough that Trump is no longer in office, and will that necessarily lead to normalcy? And what would that even look like or mean? I think there might be some concerns that we're continuing to see the outsized role that racialized politics has played, and I wonder how you might respond to this question about restoring trust in institutions and in our democracy.
Right. Talk of a return to normalcy, I think, has to consider that even in the pre-Trump era, there's declining trust in institutions among Americans. And so, removing Trump does, I think, provide something of a return to, a little bit the pre-Trump status quo, but the pre-Trump status quo wasn't too great in terms of people's faith in democracy, people's faith in American institutions, and people's sense that the country is giving them a fair shake. I think there are, obviously a variety of reasons for that. A couple that I would point to is the long pattern of gridlock and inaction in the federal government. And I think it's easy to look at that and say, well, the problem is that people are in their partisan corners, or they're too polarized, or they just need to cooperate and compromise. But there's nothing in theory, right? If you imagine sort of like a blank slate, an open room, and there's 10 people in it, 5 on one side and 5 on the other. There's nothing in theory, right, that could prevent people who have two very different ideological perspectives from cooperating on discrete issues. I think what the American system runs into right now is that we have an unusual situation in terms of political systems in which you have overlapping lines of authority, the president and the Congress. You have a government that by design needs a certain amount of consensus to work, but whose politics are for structural reasons, not really for any particular thing any particular person did, but for discrete structural reasons, make it very difficult to align that consensus. We have party government. Parties are polarized along geographic and ideological lines, along racial lines, whether that's sort of diminished somewhat, along educational lines. And in a two-party system, politics is more or less zero sum. If one side wins, the other side loses, and vice versa. And I think the extent to which those problems are kind of intractable in the absence of any kind of big shock to the system, right? So if all of a sudden, if next year California splits into 12 separate states, and then each one gets 2 senators and a bunch of reps, and 8 of them are Democrat, 8 of those states are Democratic, that would be the kind of shock to the system that might get things moving a little bit, right? Or if Texas did something similar, and you all of a sudden had a bunch of new Republican senators and Republican House members, that would kind of push the system in a certain direction. But as long as sort of the structural features of the system remain the same, that kind of stasis and inaction is going to persist. And I think it's going to continue to make voters very frustrated and lose faith. Because, frankly, if you elect people, presidents, representatives, senators, whomever, to do things, and then they cannot do them, sometimes because they are choosing not to, sometimes because the structural features of American politics make it extraordinarily difficult to do those things, it should not be a surprise that people lose faith in the ability of government to do stuff. And when you couple that with other sort of, at the moment, structural features of American life, incredibly high income inequality at levels, reaching the Gilded Age era, high cost of housing, high cost of education, of healthcare, et cetera, it really shouldn't be a surprise that people have really lost faith in the American system to actually deal with the problems that people face. And so if we're thinking about, restoring faith in institutions, if we're thinking about how can we reconnect people to American democracy, I think where we need to look is sort of serious structural change in American government that would allow the government and Congress specifically to act, to take its pride of place in the American system and actually do things for people.
Jamelle, you've presaged my next question. We heard from Project Home Fire that the majorities of Biden and Trump voters both expressed support for key elements of the bills being debated in Congress, the infrastructure and reconciliation bills, but they do not see how working with the other side fits into the bigger picture or translates into benefits for them. I wonder what can be done to change change the incentive structures so that policymakers can move beyond the deadlock and dysfunction. And what's going to happen in 2022 and 2024 if this continued dysfunction persists? Tara, can we bring you into this?
Thank you, Kara. I think the first thing that needs to happen is we need to stop rewarding performative politics. The bad behavior that we have seen take over politics and the rewarding of it through gaining more power, continuing to get elected to office, despite having any legislative accomplishments or anything of substance to point to, is, I think, a larger societal problem. And when we're seeing people get elected to offices that are serious offices, behaving in very unserious ways, it is difficult to govern when you have one side that is taking their job seriously and trying to do the legislative work to get bills passed, to get good legislation voted on and passed to help the American people. And then you have another side that's more interested in, tweets and going viral videos and ginning up the base and fundraising. It makes it tough. And there's elements of that actually on both sides, but one major party, obviously, I feel Republicans are behaving like that more so right now than the other side, mostly. Now, there, of course, is the internal kind of circular firing squad going on with Democrats who control everything on the federal level, and the difficulty in getting infrastructure and reconciliation passed because of the differences in opinion on what should be in there and spending. And those are healthy debates. But at some point, when you are in power, you have to come to an agreement, and there has to be compromise within your own caucus. And you have to, I think it's important to make sure that you take advantage of the bird in hand. And sometimes you can't always be idealistic in all of those other things when you're dealing in an environment like this, where bipartisanship is so rare when it comes to legislating. It's been really difficult for the last several election cycles to watch Congress not get much accomplished. And that is starting to trickle down into states and localities now, because they see the way some of the stars up there in Washington in Congress are behaving, and they go, oh, well, we can do that too. And it's just debasing the discourse. So in ways that I don't think any of us ever anticipated. And I've over the years since the Trump era, but I think it started before that, but really highlighted in the Trump era, I call it the Jerry Springerization of politics. And we're seeing, you're tuning in for the fight. You're not tuning in to listen to both sides and have a Dr. Phil moment. And that's, I think, unfortunate. That speaks to a larger societal problem. And I think politics is downstream from culture now. And we're seeing that reflected in the everyday battles legislatively. But the bottom line is that you just cannot continue to reward bad behavior. When you have people who are pulling political stunts, perpetuating ginning up manufactured outrage on cultural issues. These are all things that do not allow for much to get done. When you have school board meetings becoming so raucous that you have to have a police presence there, or school board members escorted out by police because they're simply advocating for COVID conscious and responsible behavior in schools to protect life. And that becomes something where you need police protection at a school board meeting. What is that? This discourse that has just become so out of control. And the penchant for violence now is another added element into this, where this is becoming rationalized by people who are now thinking that that's a way to get things accomplished, as opposed to coming together and finding common ground and working it out like you do in a democracy. And coming to those legislative compromises to do what's best for the American people. We're seeing less and less of that. I was encouraged to see some of the results from Project Home Fire that showed that 80% said that they want to find they want to maintain, I believe, democracy, it was, as the primary form of government. But 20% who don't, that's an alarming number to me in and of itself after what we've seen take place and how a loud, vocal, and very committed minority or havoc that can wreak. And I think January 6th was an example of that front and center. So we need to be very, very careful. And just to finish, in conclusion, speaking of January 6th and how do we, what's happening with legislation, we saw what happened there with a violent insurrection at our Capitol. And you just had in this past election 7 people who attended the Stop the Steal rally, not the riot, but the rally beforehand, which was about not accepting the election results of a free and fair election. They just got elected to office. And you have 57 more state and local officials who were actually at the riot up for re-election in 2022. So these people are not getting repudiated. They're becoming emboldened and empowered. And I think that is a real problem that we have to address.
Thank you, Tara. You raised this important issue about 20%. There's 80% yes that continue to support democracy as preferable to any non-democratic form of government. I think what I found perhaps also equally disturbing to that 20% was the idea that more than 3/4 of each side's voters believed elected officials from the other side represent a clear and present danger to American democracy. And not only that, but are willing to accept strong leaders in order to quell that threat. And I think that's also a significant indicator of this creeping authoritarianism that we're seeing. I wonder, David, if you would be willing to comment on, how we sort of help stave off this creeping authoritarianism.
Thank you, and it's good to be with all of you. By repudiating bad actors and by making sure that we start with the basics. I'm an immigrant who came from the Middle East, grew up in devastating civil war. And I saw in other countries where elections take place, and then if you don't like it, you stage a coup or you imprison the other side. And that's not what America is all about. And that's not what I grew up learning about American democracy in this great republic, except what we saw on January 6th was exactly an attempt to do that. But that builds from years of polarization, and those numbers that we saw are scary. 8 out of 10 would rather the other side secede and live in a different country. That is absolutely dangerous. And we're seeing that from both ends. We're seeing that from the very far left, and we're seeing that from the very far right. That is empowering this thought and fueling this. Now, look, some of it is fear, right? Election integrity played in our election in Virginia just this season. And now Governor-elect Youngkin, who I wish best of luck, and I hope that he do govern as a center-right Republican that I was told that he is. However, he trafficked in that, and we can't sweep that away. He didn't hug Trump. He didn't kiss Trump. He didn't want Trump to come with him to rallies, but he trafficked in Trumpism. And I am with Barbara. This is a loss for Trump overall as an individual. However, we saw this Trumpism play in this election. It started with quote unquote election integrity throughout the primary season, and it ended for a call for an audit just 10 days before the election. Now, good news for everyone. Virginia audits automatically, which obviously the candidate didn't know. And obviously, there's no need for an election integrity task force because guess what? If Democrats were so good who were in charge of the state, if they were so good in rigging elections, don't you think they would have rigged it for McAuliffe instead of Youngkin winning? Obviously, there is no rigging in elections, but we need to stop that. And we need to make sure what Tara said is we cannot endorse bad behavior. We cannot award bad behavior. Jamel talked about the structure of governance. We got to start with the structure of elections. before even to get to governance. Right now, we have people that are stoking fear on the right with CRT, and right at the same time at the left, everybody's pushing beyond the palette of the electorate issues that are right? I mean, we all want DEI, we all want diversity, inclusion, and equity, but the literature shows us that in the private sector, that in most companies where DEI was pushed as a requirement on the employees, they did it, they took the training, they checked the box, but it didn't make those companies more diverse. On the contrary, there's some backlash because we saw some resentment to that enforcement. Ironically, this election in Virginia started with McAuliffe starting his campaign. If you all remember, it seems like it's a million years ago, but it wasn't. It was a few months ago, with a campaign slogan that said, "Our kids, our schools, and our future." Education was his starting calling, and it ended up burning him because it burned the other side with a backlash, a race and a culture war backlash. And it was the parents that burned the candidate that started with "our kids, our schools, our future." That's that polarization. I kept hearing again and again and again from people in Northern Virginia, "I don't want my white kids to be told they're racist anymore just because they're white." Okay? I kept hearing again and again and again, "I don't need my kid to be identified by their pronoun." Okay? And that's why they're going to vote, because guess what? All Democrats now in their mind are one, and they want to take away the school rights of the parents and enforce CRT. Nobody is enforcing CRT in K-12. It didn't exist in K-12 in Virginia. It doesn't exist K-12 anywhere. But if we're just going to talk over each other, and that's what's happening, and candidates are in this vicious cycle, is I got to say this to win the primary, and after I win the primary, I got to say it again at the end so that I can get my base to come and vote for me. And now I got to worry about re-election, because guess what? The day that I was elected to the Virginia House, I was reminded by somebody in Richmond that, you know what starts today? I said, what? They go, your re-election. I said, that's not what I'm in it for, right? I don't start working on re-election the day I made it to Richmond. I did it, twice, and I got out unindicted and undefeated, and enjoyed every minute. It was the highest honor of my life to serve. But if we don't go with that mentality of we are governing to do good, and we're governing on behalf of our constituents, instead of I'm governing to get reelected and then go into that special cycle, we're going to continue to see that polarization. Instead of 8 out of 10, later you may see 9 out of 10 in the next time you run the numbers.
Damon, I want to bring you in here with regards to the role that education played in the Virginia elections. And I wonder if you can comment on how you think that will portend for national discussions on education in 2022 and perhaps even looking out to 2024. And then Jamel, I want to come back to you after that, if that's okay, because we do know that the attitudes about race and immigration are fueling these divides from the Project Homefire results. And I would love for you to talk about what might be done to overcome the political power of racial resentment and to redress the harm that the use of racial resentment as a persistent political strategy has caused.
So I just want to start out by looking at Virginia and what happened here in regards to education, and really what led up to, I think, the turn towards our governor-elect. And, we had a lot going on nationally. Of course, we have the COVID issue. We have the departure from Afghanistan, the lurch towards socialism in the federal government. And I really think people felt that and feel that they're losing so much control in their lives. And when people in Virginia, especially centrist, heard Terry McAuliffe say, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what to teach," I think that was the moment that really got people to kind of turn their head and say, "What?" It was kind of that record-scratching moment that really grabbed people. It was that one turning moment. And I don't think you have to be a conservative, in the case of Virginia, to want the opportunity to have influence over your child's education, to have input. More than likely, there are extremely few people who have ever actually tried to influence the curriculum of their school. Probably very few. However, to have the idea that not only, basically you need to not, don't even try. We don't want to hear it. I think you're seeing kind of a response from people and how they feel, in regards to their relationship with government even. You have a gubernatorial candidate who is who does not want civic engagement in that regard. I mean, we always talk about the importance of being civically engaged, but here we're having pushback, and I think citizens really woke up to that, because that's not really something that's a conservative thing. I mean, everyone wants to have the opportunity, at least, to influence the education of their children. And naturally, a large portion of the population is not going to switch from one party or the other to vote. But then there is a significant portion in the middle, especially here in Virginia, that they're not that hardcore in any particular direction, and they are going to be open to voting for a candidate that is supportive of their engagement. And as we move forward into 2022, I think we're going to see more and more people that are willing to step out and consider other candidates that might not be in their party, if they are open and want involvement. I mean, I think parents have been cooped up in their homes for a year with many of their children, and they've had a special look into education that they previously have not, and they're more involved in the lives of their children now than they used to be. And I think it's an expectation of theirs now that they should at least have the opportunity to speak up on their behalf, and should definitely not be told that you should not tell a school what to teach. I think there was one particularly effective ad that came out in Virginia, and it actually had my family. We were watching TV, and the first time we saw it, we actually busted up laughing, and it opened up by, and I forget who funded the ad, but they said, "Terry McAuliffe wants you to sit down and shut up," and it was just. It was a pretty hilarious ad, but it really, brought home an important point that government should not be telling people to not be civically engaged, for one thing, but that, it really wakes people up, wakes up parents to say, what, I do have the right to be involved in my children's education. And as we move forward in 2022, it's only going to be more so. I don't think by next year we're going to have COVID and teaching at home and all of the educational challenges we've had in the last year as a distant memory. It is still going to be there. We're still going to be living with COVID in one way or another. And if candidates are, flippant about the role parents have had and the importance of parents in their children's lives, especially as it relates to education, I think they're going to find that they have an uphill battle with a lot of candidates that they may have that voted for Biden last time, but they might be considering another party next time around. And who knows for 2024.
Well, let me start first. Say just with regards to what's happening in Washington. I've read more than my fair share of Marx and other socialist thinkers. I don't think that what's happening in Washington can be described as allergic toward socialism by any definition of the term. State action and the economy is not a socialism in and of itself. Otherwise, there'd be a lot more socialist countries. So I just think it's worth saying that with regards to sort of the use of racial resentment in election. So the Center for Politics actually had Alan Abramowitz had a great article for the Center for Politics, I think 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, where he sort of ran the numbers and tried to look at, correlation between support for Trump and various variables. And the thing he came to was, or rather, education polarization and support for Trump. And the thing he found was that attitudes on race explained the vast majority of the shift among white non-college voters. Conservative attitudes on race, to use the political science term, explains much of the shift towards Republicans, toward the Republican Party and towards Trump specifically over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that gets to sort of the difficulty here, which is that, irrespective of the frame you want to take towards understanding, the influence of racism in American politics, the fact of the matter is it is a powerful force. It has been from the beginning of the Republic's history. It's been, time and time again, politicians, candidates, parties have won elections on sort of demagoguing on racial issues. There's a term for it from the Jim Crow era that's not really appropriate for public consumption, but the fact that the term exists gets to the fact that this has been a potent strategy for a long time. The extent to which 20 years ago, not quite 20 years ago, there was a little less racial polarization in American politics than there is now. And one reason that was the case is because both parties didn't do it as much, right? It declined in salience. And so one sort of immediate way, right, to reduce the impact of race, reduce the power of negative racial appeals in American politics is for other issues to raise in salience and kind of take the place, take that emotional energy up. But unfortunately, that requires a bit of forbearance on part of both parties. And the simple fact of the matter is I think it's unrealistic really to expect, because it's not as if the United States is a society without genuine racial conflict. It's not as if every American believes in the political and social equality of every other American. It's not as if, claims or demands for racial equality do not conflict with existing hierarchies and power relations. And so as soon as those things enter into politics, they're going to produce a reaction, and politicians are going to capitalize on that reaction. And so, how do we reduce the temperature? I mean, in the long term, right, you reduce the salience of race by reducing the salience of race, by making the policy interventions, making the moves that would disentangle race from people's life chances, disentangle race from people's material positions, disentangle race from sort of the distribution of resources, right? Dismantle race hierarchy, you might say. But in the absence of that, right? In the presence of institutions, right, like the criminal justice system, institutions, or structural factors of structural conditions of the American economy, like the persistently high unemployment rate among African Americans, like residential segregation, which remains sort of a powerful force in the United States. In the presence of those things, which serve to kind of reinscribe racial difference, right? That serve to reinforce racial ideologies. I don't, this is the most depressing answer I could give, but I don't think that race is going to sort of vanish or diminish in salience in American politics. The most that can happen is that we get polarized along some other line, right? So we get polarized even more strongly along class, or we get polarized as we are even strongly among education, and that begins to cause the immediate political salience of race to decline a little bit. And there is some evidence, right, that education polarization of the last 2 election cycles has resulted in at least a reversion to the mean with regards to Republican support among African Americans, and maybe even help increase the Republican Party's share of Latino voters. So that's sort of, that's something on the margins. But as long as we have these actual substantive material divides in American society that are tied up in race, and specifically, I kind of dislike the term tied up in race because race is a fiction, right? It's a biological fiction. Tied up in racism, right? Sort of the set of social practices that emerged around various forms of inequality in this country. As long as those things retain force in American society, so too will race in American politics. You kind of can't separate the two out.
Thank you,
Can I
Jamel.
just say something really quick about that, just really fast?
Yes, of course.
2 things on the issue of race. I too, like Jamel, don't see that dissipating anytime soon. If not, I think it gets worse before it gets better, even as we see the demographics in this country changing. As someone who's of mixed race, I am very I have the blessing and the curse of seeing things from both sides oftentimes. And as we see more and more of society mainstream society becoming more accepting of interracial couples and families and blended families, and we see this in commercials, on television and entertainment, the people who are not as accepting of this new demographic reality in America are becoming more and more motivated to speak up about that. It's the fear of the other. So you have these competing interests of a more tolerant society when it comes to biracial couples and gay couples and families, and what people used to think were the traditional family. That's changing now. We're becoming more tolerant of what family structures are. But then on the flip side of that too, you see these people, and I think that's even reflected in the Project Homefire information, that this idea of immigration and race is really animating. So I see it getting worse before it gets better, but I do think that it will get better just because the country's changing no matter what. And the people who are less accepting of it, that demographic is dying off. So but I don't know how soon that happens. And the other thing about education being another animating force here, not only was that the case in Virginia, but it was also the case in New Jersey. And it was, normally you have the top ticket influencing down ballot races. That definitely happened in Virginia. It was the reverse in New Jersey, where it was school board races and school and education issues at a local level that actually brought more people out and got more Republicans out to vote, and more parents interested in voting than the other way around, because voter turnout in New Jersey was incredibly low. I think it was 37%, the lowest it's been in a generation. And a lot of that was on the Democrat side. And there's 1 million more Democrats registered in New Jersey than there are Republicans. And yet we saw how close the race was. But there was a very specific example of where education had an influence on a statewide race as well, because it started there with parents being very upset about different things. But New Jersey also has a very active history when it comes to education issues for decades and decades, whether it's funding and how it's funded and quality of education. It's an ongoing thing. But that's another example, to Jamel's point, where education has been at the centerpiece of a lot of elections.
And could I jump in?
Barbara,
on the
yes, please.
Education issue too, because I come from a family of educators. My mom was actually a teacher in New Jersey, and my husband was a principal in Fairfax County, and my sister also. So I've watched this from the from the teacher angle, the administrator angle, and now as a grandmother, I got to watch grandkids home here in Virginia during the pandemic, and public schools really, people got to see how much they failed. And my husband now is retired from public schools in a private school. They stayed open, hybrid, really tried to accommodate, work with the kids. If the kids have learning disabilities, what are we going to do? They really had a lot of dialogue with the parents. Whereas if you were in the public schools, you just got cut off, your kids were on a screen. What if you're a single mom and your kid is home? What are you supposed to do with them? What do you do with a 8-year-old who's going to be home all day in front of a screen while you have to go to work? So I think this education issue, as Damon said, was a much bigger issue and frustration where they got to see the system up close, and it wasn't pretty. And it wasn't particularly the topics they were teaching, it was how they were teaching, what was going on, and just seeing this dereliction of duty, and then seeing the teacher unions dictating whatever the Democrats did. Like when we gave the teachers the first vaccines, then they were protesting about going back to school. My husband got his vaccine, and then they were in school and they did more full time. So I think this failure, and like in Fairfax County, 5% of the students have left. And I think some of them are like my daughter, who she decided when it came time for this year, her daughter, they're in a private school. Actually, they were last year. So it was last year too, because she just said, I'm not going to have her lose a year of education. But these kids who are disadvantaged, I can tell you, Kirk Cox, who I expect will be the Secretary of Education, he had a whole plan on how are we going to help those kids who have gotten left behind, particularly a bigger gap over this past year and a half. And I look forward to seeing some really good collaboration on that, because the kids who got left behind the most and are going to need summer school and get after school help are going to be the disadvantaged population's minority. And I do think you're going to see someone in Kirk Cox, who I do expect he'll be Secretary of Education, who will address that. And I think that was underlying some of the general frustration. So when Terry said, parents shouldn't tell schools what to teach, well, parents were kind of saying, why aren't you helping my kids more? Why aren't you calling? I mean, my husband calls his students at night still. And okay, what do we need to get caught up on? And that just wasn't happening in the public schools. And I think there's going a post-pandemic shakeup of the public school system. And I think when you see charter schools, which will probably be targeted for low-income, disadvantaged families also, and having more choice is really going to shake up the education establishment in a way that I think you're going to have bipartisan support for.
I want to come back to the topic of immigration as well. Tara started discussing this, and we saw this come out in the Project Home Fire results, that in addition to divides over race, immigration is also fueling divides and making it very difficult to achieve progress on policy proposals. David, given these deep divides over immigration, what do you see as a path forward that takes us away from zero-sum thinking, but also takes into account the expressed concerns from conservatives that immigration might make them suffer personally from American cultural change or lead to discrimination against white people?
Yeah, look, we got to distill the myth of immigration, right? The big boogeyman of immigrants are going to come over and take over the country. This is a country of immigrants, a country by immigrants who are part and fiber. If you all saw the immigrants get the job done, that little segment in Hamilton, we do get the job done. Immigrants are here to stay, and immigrants will continue to be here to stay and do so. I can solve the immigration problem in America in one day with 10 members of Congress from both sides if they come in and decide we're here to solve it. Both sides, historically, Republicans and Democrats, have played with the immigration issue and has absolutely used it and abused it for their political purposes. That's the left and that's the right. Historically, we have problems with unions that didn't want immigration. And historically, more recent historical, is we have the right that are using immigration as a boogeyman. In an open market system as we do, as an employer, I'm an entrepreneur, if I want to hire Mr. or Miss XYZ from anywhere in the world, I should be able to fill out a form and be able to bring him in and hire them to do a job. That's not mean I'm going to immigrate them. That means I'm going to bring them in to come and work for me, a work visa. We have no such thing in America. We have limited work visas for farmers, the H system. We have limited work visas for professionals, the H-1B system. I think we have 65 to 85,000 of those, which is a huge number. Right now, that is a minute number that disappears. I think the deadline to apply is October 15, and by midnight of that day, they have double that amount. They actually have a lottery system on who got his application first through Federal Express. It's ridiculous. If immigration is this big divide, as we saw from Larry's work, then absolutely let's solve immigration. And it takes both members of Congress from both sides to sit down at one table with the idea that we're not going to play politics in this. And I can rewrite that immigration code, which if anybody had seen it, it'll probably stack up this high from the ground. It's useless. It is antiquated. And we can solve it in one day if we have the political might to do it. So let's start there. And once you have, and look, everybody talks about illegal immigration. No, they're not. They're talking about immigration overall, right? Trump talked about regular immigration. I mean, he demonized immigrants altogether. And in the past, the far left demonized legal immigration altogether because they don't want cheap labor to come in, because the immigrants used to be laborers when they come in. Today, we bring the cream of the crop, not just the labor that we need. Because let me tell you something, there are no immigrants. Today, they happen to be illegal. There will be no orange juice for any one of us to drink in the morning. There will be no eggs for any of us to fry in the morning. And if you go to any one of our engineering schools, I think we got 3 or 4 best of the best that are represented on this panel. There would be no engineers in our ITs or PhDs that are running those departments. And there'll be half the Nobel laureates and half the innovation IT companies that exist today if it wasn't for immigrants. So this is not just an illegal immigration problem, this is an immigration problem. And we dispel that by opening up immigration in the country and opening up work visas in the country. Let the best of the best and let the workers that we need come in. We need the professionals, we need the laborers, we need all kinds and walks from all over the world that are willing to come here and be part of this great republic. And that'll solve it. If you have enough visas, if you have enough legal immigrants that are available to fill the market, there will not be illegal immigration. Nobody wants to come in illegally if they can come in legally. Who wants to jump in through the door? I used to be told all the time by my friends, well, David, the door is open. Let them go line up and stand in line. There's no line. We got to create the line. And you don't just open up your door, you got to invite them in. I challenge anybody who's watching today. You probably all live in nice neighborhoods, even on minority issues starting within our country, not just outside the country, minorities inside the country. You live in a nice neighborhood, go open up your front door, double door if you got double doors, and sit in your living room, see how many people walk in on their own. They don't. When Barbara Comstock and I won in Virginia, we went out to every immigrant in our areas. We knocked on their doors. We crashed a wedding together once. And that's how we got immigrants. I swear to you, we crashed a wedding together once. We did. An Indian-American wedding. And
we had wonderful Diwali festivals on Diwali here today to celebrate. I missed that.
Absolutely. And so when we do these things, when we welcome immigrants and when we include them and engage them, not just diversity in general, where we toast to drink to them, we include them and engage them, and then open up legal immigration. That'll solve the illegal immigration problem, and that'll solve this polarization problem, because they will see that there is no. I'll give you a final note. So look, I'm married from Southwest Virginia. Until I got down there and met with my in-laws now 20 years ago, they had never met a foreigner, right? A foreigner in their life. They don't know. They've never met him. They don't have interactions. Sure, they've seen TV and they've seen him online in shows, but there has not been this interaction. And this rural vote that is scared of immigrants and think they're going to take their job and think that there's going to affect their taxes and think that they're going to change the fiber of America that they live in is a part of our electorate that has not interacted with immigrants. And that we can solve. So let's all go to every member of Congress now, Democrat and Republicans, and tell them to get off their butts and actually go solve the immigration problem.
Well, and I do
Thank
think
you, David.
I think there's a post-pandemic opportunity here, because what do we have right now? Huge work shortages. Everybody, every business you talk to in every district, red or blue, needs more people to do work. And we're going to shake up how work, a lot of us are going to work at home. A lot of us are going to work for ourselves. A lot of us are changing how we work, and we need more people. So I think there's an opportunity there. And David's right. In Congress, it was always each side wanted to have an issue instead of solve the problem. And we had legislation that we tried to get pushed through that, when the Republicans wanted to do it, the Democrats wanted to have the issue, and vice versa. But now it's a necessity to get workers. And if everyone would just listen to their employers and listen to the businesses in their districts wherever you go, this would be a great way to, come together and just open the doors, like David said, and have more people here and make sure they're employed. If they're employed, there you go, right?
Kyle, I want to bring you into the conversation and appreciate your patience tonight. We both Jamel and David mentioned the rural and the divides between rural and urban communities. Where do you expect the locus of competition to be in 2022 and even maybe into 2024? And what strategies do you think candidates are going to pursue as a result of that locus of competition?
One of the things that was so striking about the Virginia results was just how awesome Republican turnout was, particularly outside of, everywhere in the state. And Democratic turnout, I think, was good too. The total number of votes in Virginia was 3.3 million, which is the highest turnout ever by raw numbers, and also markedly higher turnout even than 2017, which was defined by great turnout as well. But what you saw in Western Virginia, like the 9th congressional district, the 6th congressional district, et cetera, is you saw Glenn Youngkin getting even bigger margins than Donald Trump got. And also that turnout, spiked in those areas even from 2017. And what I think is so striking about that is lots of places in Western Virginia, they're not really growing, and in fact some of them are depopulating, which I think we saw in the census. But those places really kind of punched above their weight in this election and were really helpful to Glenn Youngkin. And I was talking to a good Democratic source before the election, and he told me that for all the focus on the suburbs, keep an eye on Democratic margins and the turnout in some of the really rural places, because I'm concerned, this is the Democrat talking, that the bottom is just going to drop out and that we're going to have this horrible problem. And he was exactly right. That is what happened. Again, Youngkin ran way ahead of Ralph Northam and Joe Biden did, or rather Donald Trump and Ed Gillespie did in recent years. But that was important. And I just think about when you think about the Democratic position and some of the places that have big races coming up this year, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin have Senate races. There's going to be a big governor's race in Michigan where Gretchen Whitmer is going to run for a second term. And as bad as it's been for Democrats in kind of the outstate areas, I think there should be a lot of concern for Democrats that it's just going to get worse, and that they're not going to have enough votes in the suburbs and city centers to make it up. So that's a big story to watch, and it's one that I think analysts can sort of ignore, because you look at all these small counties and say, oh, there aren't that many people there, but boy, it sure adds up, and it definitely added up for Youngkin on Tuesday.
So we're starting to get some questions coming in from our audience tuning in. Thank you for those questions. If you are joining us, please feel free to email questions@virginia.edu, and we'll be able to ask our panelists. We do have a first question. Isn't there a case to be made, an array of light to be seen, that the election results in Virginia, both last year's presidential contest and this year's gubernatorial contest, suggests that a majority of elections have rejected extreme ideology, Trumpism last year and wokeism this year?
Yes.
Can I jump in briefly on the topic? And I think it's one where I think one element that we've not really talked much about, and we haven't heard much about in the media, is actually the Republican Party of Virginia's means of selecting their candidates. I think this year, Well, for those of you who are not from Virginia, the Republican Party held a convention, but not a normal convention where you meet in one place and everyone, jockeys and votes. It was a convention spread out across the Commonwealth of Virginia where people could drive in and cast their votes in ranked choice order and then drive away. And I think this was particularly effective for Republicans this year because I don't believe that it was automatic that a Republican was going to win this year. I think a Republican won this year because the candidates that were chosen were candidates that were more centrist, that were not grenade throwers. What we ultimately came up with were a series of candidates that, people who did not like Trump were comfortable with voting for. And clearly, because that's what happened. But I think the party should consider, at least in Virginia, should consider continuing on with this means of candidate selection. It's not a primary, so you don't have as many people voting. But as we all know, the primaries always attract the most passionate voters. And so some of our candidates who might be a little bit more moderate are often left behind, and we're left with people who really probably don't reflect at least the middle or close to the middle. So I think looking at that model of candidate selection might be something that the Republican Party of Virginia should probably look towards in the future.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. The convention system for choosing a candidate, I think, was probably the single best decision the Republican Party of Virginia made this year, in that it did allow it to circumvent the challenges, the statement said, the challenges it's had over the last decade in selecting more mainstream candidates. Political science nerds will note that there's always some sort of, there's this tension, right, between a more democratic process and the process that serves the objectives of the party itself. And I think you can see with Youngkin's selection the virtues of a process that, at least for the party, that sort of clamps down a little on democratic participation, but enables the party to choose someone who might be a more effective standard bearer. Just real quick on the question, I mostly just say I just kind of reject the premise, because I'm just not really sure what quote unquote wokeism even is. I hear that term a lot, and no one ever seems to be able to define it in ways that actually describe the Democrat or mainstream Democratic candidates and politicians as they exist. It seems odd to me to use that term in the context of an election where the Democratic standard bearer is Terry McAuliffe, who, say what you will about him, is not any kind of extremist of any sort, at least not along the lines that we're discussing here. I will say, I mean, my view of this election is that I'm not sure that we should use it as fuel for any kind of big political or ideological narratives of what's happening in American politics. If you zoom out from Virginia a little bit, and I know that can be a little difficult because Virginians, and I'm a Virginian, can be a little parochial about things. If you zoom out from Virginia a little bit and look at New Jersey, where there's also this big swing against the Democrat, what you begin to see is something that looks less like any, it begins to look much more like a thermostatic reaction, right? Sort of like a pendulum swing and an automatic pendulum swing against the incumbent party, especially in an environment where, Biden's popularity has declined significantly for reasons that are varied and not exactly entirely straightforward, but it has declined significantly. The shift in Virginia was uniform across the entire state, right? It wasn't that there were some areas that became much more Republican than others, but kind of a uniform shift across the entire state. It begins to look like something a bit more mechanistic and a bit less conducive to being fit into any particular narrative. And I feel like, I've been in the political analysis game for like over 10 years now. And one of the things I've really learned coming out of the past 4 years is that it's probably worthwhile to be a little more humble about our ability to slot any particular event in any kind of larger or grander narrative. And that's what I would caution here.
One of the other topics that we haven't yet had a chance to broach is the role of state laws. Damon brought up the election, the convention, the Republicans' mechanism for nomination this year using the convention, but we're also seeing broad moves across the state legislatures, introducing both restrictive measures in states that tend to be controlled by Republican legislatures and an increase in voting access laws in states that are controlled by more Democratic legislatures. I wonder how these divergent voting laws are going to affect trust in election administrations and election outcomes as we move into 2022 and 2024.
I'll just throw in two observations. Is one thing, I think both last year and this year, Virginia had very good elections. And these were under rules that were, Democrats kind of had made it easier to vote in different ways, things that I support. I like Sunday voting. I like having longer absentee voting. And our elections were fair. And then this week, you also had very fair elections. So I would also point out to Republicans that Republicans lost the majority, lost seats when we were operating under the rules that Republicans put in effect. So these rules, I think they sometimes get overemphasized. I think what you had this record turnout because people want to participate, they get there to vote. And so I do think too many of these bills that are going on out there don't realize it's like get people animated by issues and make it easy for them to vote, and don't try and rig the system either way on either side, because having a big turnout is good. I know the beginning when we heard there was going to be something like 3 million turnout initially, it was, oh, that's bad for Republicans. Well, no, it wasn't. So this is good. We want to have more people vote, and we shouldn't, whatever side you're on, you shouldn't be afraid of more people voting.
Well, with all due respect to my colleague, Barbara Comstock, on this, she is not representative of most Republicans across the country who want to expand voting. Let's be honest here. We've seen what's gone on in Georgia, in Texas, in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I mean, we're seeing the replication of trying to restrict voting rights so that Republicans can get an advantage. And to Barbara's point, you would think that they would want more people to vote, but they've been very open about the fact that they can't win elections if more people are voting. So let's do everything we can. Exactly. And it's also anti-American and it's anti-democratic. It's very illiberal. And this highlights the importance of paying attention to state and local races. A lot of voters, and with voter turnout, I'm glad to see more of it happening, like in Virginia. But in my home state of New Jersey, you had a depressed Democratic turnout because there wasn't the same sense of urgency. I would hope that Democrats continue to hammer home the importance of participating in voting and in those state and local elections, because some of the people who are running to administer elections, supervisors of elections, secretaries of state, these are people who don't believe that the presidential election was free and fair. That should not be cast aside going into 2022. If you have someone running for office that does not believe that Joe Biden was the legitimately elected president, and they go along with Donald Trump stop the steal nonsense and that it was all fraudulent, this is a problem. And even though Virginia worked out well for the for Republicans, Does anyone honestly think Donald Trump is going to sit back and go away and just hang out and play golf at Mar-a-Lago in 2022? No way. Most candidates across the country, as long as you still have a Republican leadership, political leadership that's embracing Donald Trump, they're going to have to put up with him inserting himself and his ilk into 2022. So if he had gone away and it had been repudiated, then Barbara's approach to things would probably work out much better for Republicans. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is Trump's presence, even though he may not be on the ballot. But Trumpism and a lot of his acolytes that are running for offices and what they're pushing for, which is not a more expanded and democratic election system, it's a more restricted one, and attacking voter rights in ways we haven't seen since the 60s. I think that that's going to be an issue that Democrats really, really need to highlight and make sure that that elections are administered fairly and that they do elect people or vote against folks who are trying to restrict voting rights. That's something that should not be acceptable in the United States of America in 2021.
I would very much agree with that. People like Jody Hice in Georgia or people in Arizona who are running on the big lie, who are running for Secretary of State, that's very dangerous. And there's still plenty of these people I oppose, believe me. And
way too many, unfortunately, Barbara.
Yeah, the ones who are trying to, get in there and want to be able to fix the elections. Yeah, that is not good. And Brad Raffensperger, God bless him, and Jody Hice, no.
Tara, I'd like to follow on to that. Both Tara and Barbara are correct here. Tara's right. We can't let that happen because there is a current push by the Trump section of the party, or at least by the Trump influence that's making everybody in the Republican Party push towards that. Barbara is correct that they should all listen to her, is that that's not the right way to go. And she used two examples. When Republicans drew the laws in Virginia and they were in charge, they ended up losing. And then Democrats, when they were in charge and they drew the laws, they ended up losing. The more that we get people to vote and to register to vote, to engage, the better it is. And that is definitely an advice that they should hear on both sides of the aisle. Now, look, in Virginia, we passed some good laws as well during Republican periods. Have you all registered to vote online or updated your registration online in Virginia? It was easy. It is quick. It's secure. I know. I wrote that law, and I wrote it with a majority of Republicans that were in charge. So open it up. It'll be good for everybody. And the Republicans that won this time can thank me for it because more people had registered, despite the fact that it was under Democrat control that monitored this election and ran it.
So, David, you just mentioned writing the laws. The other things that political parties tend to do is write the districts or draw the districts. And this is another issue that we only have a few minutes left, but it's really important, perhaps even more so than the voting access questions, the voting rights questions. Kyle, if I can bring you back in here, how do you think redistricting is going to impact elections in 2022 and 2024?
First of all, in Virginia, the voters in the legislature together created this independent, this redistricting commission made up of legislators and of citizens. And unfortunately, it basically failed. And so the Virginia Supreme Court is essentially going to have to draw the districts. Across the country, one of the things I think we're seeing is that you may see the number of actually competitive districts, which is small anyway, but may very well go away as parties try to basically draw as many safe districts as they can for themselves. The Texas Republicans, they've just finished up their map. That's a kind of a good example of that sort of trend. You're also seeing aggressive gerrymandering in some places. North Carolina Republicans just put out a map today that I would describe as pretty aggressive gerrymander. We'll see if it survives court scrutiny in that state. Illinois Democrats did the same thing. You might see New York Democrats do the same thing. The advantage for Republicans is just that they control the redistricting process in more places than the Democrats do. But also, we are seeing a growing movement toward commission-based systems, particularly out west. But the commissions sometimes don't work out that great. And I have to do this because I have a new book out called The Long Red Thread, which is about the U.S. House and it's about redistricting and the history of all this stuff. So if you're interested in it, please check it out. And so anyway, apologies for the book plug, but I needed to get that in.
Can I jump in on this real quick?
Yes, please, Jamel.
I think we're so used to the way we do things when it comes to drawing districts and such, to district-based elections, that I think it's just worth thinking about whether or not we actually want to continue doing this way of organizing the House of Representatives. There's nothing in the Constitution that, for example, prevents Congress from passing a law mandating, mandating the states essentially being single-member districts or multi-member districts, where you use ranked choice and some other form of voting to get a perhaps more representative slate in every state to represent the state. I think that the extreme partisan gerrymandering at the level we're seeing, it makes a mockery of the idea that these are representative elections. I was just actually looking at some proposals, and the Ohio legislature is looking at a gerrymander that might deliver upwards of 80% of the seats to the Republican Party, which only won the state by 53%. And I think we have this bad habit of saying, well, this is a blue state and this is a red state, not understanding that there are very few places in the country where a party is winning by greater than 60% or losing by greater than 40 or lower than 40% vote share. And in most places, in the country, partisan balance is, if not even, then sort of like within 10 points of being even. And so the idea that you can live in a state, be part of the voting, block that regularly gets 45% of the vote, but only have 25% of the representation, I just think is like a basic problem on the level of sort of like political equality, right? And the United States is already a system where political equality is sort of like not necessarily honored in every electoral circumstance. The Senate is a good example of this, but the House is supposed to be the chamber that represents the population as best as possible. And I think we should be thinking about ways to actually make that the case.
Well, on that note, I want to just thank you all so much for joining us for the University of Virginia Center for Politics' 23rd Annual American Democracy Conference. Sincerely appreciate all of your insights tonight. Please, if you're joining us, check out the Project Homefire results, check out Kyle's new book, and please follow all of our guests. And join us next Thursday evening at 7 p.m. for the premiere of Common Grounds. Go to eventbrite.com and search for Common Grounds premiere. Have a good evening.